The death of Catherine of Valois in 1437 was not marked by the usual procession of pageantry mourning and ritual that followed the passing of a Queen of England. There were no solemn rows of black-veiled courtiers, no marble tomb commissioned, and no grand pronouncements of her place in the royal lineage. Instead, her death was like a whisper lost in the echo of England's shifting dynasties, quiet, inconvenient, and intentionally uncelebrated. But something was different this time. Catherine was no ordinary queen consort. She was the widow of Henry V, England's great warrior king, and the mother of Henry II, who was at the time of her death only a boy king wobbling under the weight of a fragile crown. Yet in the moments following her final breath at Bermondsey Abbey, royal officials acted not with reverence but with bureaucratic haste. Her body was placed in a plain lead coffin and transported without honor to Westminster Abbey. There was no queenly tomb prepared, no ceremonial farewell, just silence and a locked door. Her retreat from the public eye had begun years before her death. Once the glamorous daughter of King Charles VI of France and Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, Catherine, had been a political bride offered to Henry VIII as part of the Treaty of Troyes. Their marriage had been celebrated as a union of empires England and France war and peace. Yet Catherine, beautiful and strategic, quickly became a symbol of foreignness in a court that distrusted outsiders. After Henry V's sudden death in 1422, she was left widowed at 21 with a 9-month-old son destined to become king of both England and France, at least in theory. But England had no intention of allowing her to wield power. Instead of embracing her as queen mother or regent, the court confined her role. She was granted a modest allowance and denied any real influence over her son's upbringing. Her presence at court diminished, and her correspondence was monitored. It was not just distrust, it was calculated marginalization. There was an unspoken understanding that Catherine, if left unchecked, might remarry, and worse, might remarry a man beneath her station. That risk in the eyes of a paranoid nobility could produce dangerous heirs children of half-royal blood who might one day claim the throne. Catherine's fertility in effect became a state liability. So her life shrank. She retreated to Bermondsey Abbey not as a penitent nun, but as a political inconvenience cloaked in monastic exile. There, removed from court politics and public scrutiny, she lived in relative quiet. She was seen at times in Windsor and Greenwich, but she wielded no influence, no court, no authority. For years her existence was like that of a ghost felt but rarely seen. Even in death, Catherine's body was treated as a problem to be solved, not a queen to be mourned. The transportation of her coffin to Westminster Abbey was not ceremonial, it was administrative. She was buried near the shrine of St. Edward the Confessor, but not interred in a royal tomb or honored with effigies. Her coffin was placed above ground beside a pillar in what seemed a temporary resting place. But the temporary would stretch on for centuries. The symbolism was unmistakable. Here lay a queen denied a queen's burial. Her final position was liminal physically in Westminster Abbey, yet spatially denied the grandeur afforded to monarchs. Her lead coffin sat exposed, unsealed, and unfenced directly in the path of passing clergy and visitors. Over the decades and then the centuries, her coffin became something else entirely, an object of morbid curiosity, a conversation piece, even a warning. It's unclear why her burial was never completed properly. Perhaps the political tensions of the time, the instability of Henry VI's reign, the rising power of the Dukes of York, or the memory of Catherine's secret scandal made her legacy too delicate to enshrine. Perhaps the court was simply indifferent. Or perhaps her improper burial was an act of deliberate historical suppression. And yet the silence surrounding her death only amplified its mystery. When pilgrims passed through Westminster Abbey, they would often stumble upon her coffin by accident. At first it was overlooked, then whispered about, then touched. By the 17th century, children were reportedly playing near it. The lead casing had buckled with time, revealing glimpses of linen bone and collapsed flesh. Her body, originally embalmed with herbs and wrapped in cerecloth, had partially mummified in the airtight coffin, resisting decay far longer than anyone expected. This was not reverence. It was exposure. And as the years passed, Catherine's neglected corpse would become a symbol of something profoundly unsettling, a queen whose legacy had been politically erased, whose body remained literally above ground, waiting for dignity that would never arrive. What began as silent exclusion was slowly turning into a grotesque spectacle. But the true desecration had yet to come. The uncomfortable treatment of Catherine of Valois in death had deep roots in how the English crown tried to control her in life. The suspicion wasn't merely personal, it was institutional. Just 5 years after Henry V's death, Parliament passed a law that on its face seemed procedural. But buried within its language was something unprecedented, an explicit warning to a living queen dowager, and an implicit threat to any man foolish enough to love her. The act passed in 1427 declared that no dowager queen of England, Catherine being the only living one at the time, could remarry without the consent of the king and his council. And if she did, not only would her husband forfeit all his lands and goods, but any children from the union would receive nothing. On the surface, it was legalese. In practice, it was surveillance disguised as law. It was as if the crown had read Catherine's thoughts before she acted. The law wasn't reactive, it was preemptive. She had committed no public offense. There was no scandal, no known lover, no bastard child in the court nursery. Yet the government treated her womb as a threat. Behind the careful wording was a singular fear that Catherine might bear more sons. It wasn't Catherine's allure that troubled them, it was her bloodline. She was, after all, the daughter of Charles VI of France. Her son was King of England. If she were to marry again and have more children, those offspring would be half royal with vague but dangerous claims to the throne. In an era where lineage was currency, that made her potential progeny a political landmine. And so the law was passed not as guidance, but as a warning. But Catherine was already ahead of them. Sometime in the early 1430s, she began a relationship with a man whose name would remain hidden for years. Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier of uncertain nobility, but undeniable charisma. Tudor had served in her household at Windsor, possibly as her keeper of the wardrobe or simply a servant close enough to be trusted and close enough to be noticed. Their relationship unfolded in the margins. No contemporary chronicler recorded a wedding. No poet sang of their love. And yet by 1432, Catherine had given birth to a son. Over the next few years, she would have at least 2 more. Whether they married in secret or never at all remains disputed. But the implications were volcanic. To royal officials, this wasn't romance, it was betrayal. The Queen Mother had not only broken protocol, she had birthed a rival bloodline, and not just any bloodline. The descendants of this hidden union would one day become the House of Tudor, the dynasty that would dominate English history under Henry VII, Henry VIII, and Elizabeth I. But at the time, these children were political embarrassments, illegitimate, unacknowledged, and impossible to ignore. When Catherine's health began to decline around 1436, she made the fateful decision to retreat to Bermondsey Abbey, a place of quiet exile where queens went not to be venerated, but to be hidden. She died there in 1437, far from court and far from power, having never seen her eldest son crowned, or her youngest walk. And the man she loved, Owen Tudor, was promptly arrested. What happened to Owen is a study in controlled panic. He was seized by agents of the crown and imprisoned in Newgate. His offense was not officially sedition, treason, or fraud. It was proximity. He had dared to touch what the monarchy had claimed as untouchable, a queen's body. Catherine's corpse was ignored, but Owen's living breath became a threat. For a time it looked as though he might be executed, but the political winds shifted. Henry VI, now a teenager, eventually acknowledged Owen's role, perhaps not openly, but functionally. Owen was released. His sons were given minor posts. But the stain of the affair lingered like mold beneath the stone floors of Westminster. The law that had tried to prevent Catherine's remarriage stayed on the books. Its subtext was clear. Female royalty, unlike male monarchs, were vessels of lineage, not agents of love. Their bodies were not their own. They were dynastic weapons to be regulated, silenced, and sealed off. And so Catherine's body, when buried, was not honored. It was hidden. What no one foresaw was how this attempt to erase a scandal would create something far worse. A half-century later, her children's descendants would launch a claim on the crown during one of England's bloodiest periods. The Wars of the Roses were not just dynastic squabbles, they were the unacknowledged aftershocks of Catherine's love life. But that reckoning was still in the distance. In the present, the body of the former queen lay in a plain coffin, elevated like an afterthought against a stone pillar, absent of epitaph or monument. Owen was free but watched. Their children were growing but kept small. And all the while a law remained carved into parchment that made a single point unmistakably clear. Queens could be mothers, but they must never be women. In the years following Catherine's death, the silence surrounding her scandalous union with Owen Tudor became a weapon in itself, sharp, deliberate, and quietly dangerous. Officially, no marriage was recorded, no proclamations of legitimacy, no royal acknowledgement. Yet by the mid-15th century, the implications of her secret life began to haunt the very institutions that had once sought to suppress her. It started with her sons. Edmund and Jasper, Tudor names that would one day ripple through British history, were raised not in royal halls, but in liminal spaces, neither noble nor common visible, yet undefined. They were not bastards in the legal sense, for no one could prove or disprove a marriage. But they were certainly not legitimate heirs either. Their existence posed a delicate problem, how to deny their status without admitting the crown had something to hide. The monarchy's solution was strategic ambiguity. Henry VI, Catherine's legitimate son and now king in his own right, quietly took his half-brothers into royal favor. They were granted noble titles. Jasper became Earl of Pembroke, Edmund Earl of Richmond. But these honors came without heritage. The Tudors had no ancestral claim, no vast estates, no ancient lineage to buttress their rise. Their power flowed from the king's favor alone, an uncomfortable arrangement for a nobility obsessed with bloodlines. And yet even as they were elevated, they were not embraced. At court, whispers surrounded them. Who were these sons of a disgraced queen and a Welsh servant? What precedent did this set? Could any royal widow take a lover now and expect her children to rise in power? It was a question no one wanted to answer. The ambiguity of their origin was in truth their shield. If Catherine and Owen had married in secret, then their sons might be lawful. If they had not, then every privilege granted to Edmund and Jasper was a legal fiction. But no one dared probe too deeply because either answer could shake the monarchy itself. Still, there were signs of calculated discomfort. The Tudors were kept close, but not too close. Promoted, but not exalted. And most telling of all, Catherine's memory was never publicly rehabilitated. Her name faded from public inscriptions, her likeness absent from official portraits. Even her burial place remained conspicuously undecorated. She was not erased entirely, but she was intentionally dimmed like a candle left to flicker out. Yet history, like pressure sealed in stone, has a way of breaking free. In 1456, Edmund Tudor married Margaret Beaufort, a teenage heiress with a royal lineage of her own. A year later, she gave birth to a son, Henry Tudor, under fraught and near-fatal circumstances. Edmund would not live to see the child's face. He died of plague before his son was even born. But his bloodline lived on, and with it the dormant power of Catherine's secret. For Henry Tudor, the grandson of Catherine and Owen legitimacy was both weapon and wound. He was an heir by accident, an outgrowth of royal fear and forbidden love. His claim to the throne would be tenuous, his right contested, but he would survive the Wars of the Roses, defeat Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, and crown himself Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. In this triumph, Catherine of Valois was retroactively exalted, but only partially. The early Tudors were careful not to dwell too deeply on her story. Her marriage to Owen was never publicly confirmed. Her coffin remained untouched. Even Henry VII, her grandson and king, made no immediate move to rebury her or honor her grave. It was as if the shame of her choices still echoed through stone. There was, however, one subtle gesture. In 1502, Henry VII ordered the repair of several royal tombs within Westminster Abbey. Among them was his own future resting place, designed with architectural grandeur. But Catherine's grave remained untouched, still tucked by the wall, her body still encased in that warped lead coffin from 1437. Visitors passed by her without knowing they stood beside the mother of a dynasty. And then there was the boy. Henry VII had been born in exile, raised in fear and crowned in violence. To him, lineage was a battleground, not a birthright. He never publicly condemned his grandmother's choices, but neither did he dare celebrate them. Her story remained a hushed secret in Tudor halls, spoken of only when necessary and only in shadows. Even so, her legacy could not be sealed forever. As Tudor power expanded, curious eyes began to look backward. Antiquarians, historians, and even court gossips wanted to know who was this Catherine. Why had she been left out of the grand story? What secrets still lingered beneath the abbey stones? and eventually someone would dare to look. But before her body would be disturbed, before curious fingers reached for what should have remained untouched, Catherine existed in a kind of suspended purgatory, honored in blood but shamed in memory. Her lover was long dead, her sons were legends, and her coffin sat in a public corridor, absorbing centuries of footsteps, dust, and silence. She was a queen with no monument, the grandmother of kings without a proper grave, but the veil that protected her would not hold forever. For most queens of England, Westminster Abbey is a place of grandeur, marble effigies, stained glass tributes, and Latin inscriptions etched in stone. It is a place where legacy is performed, not simply preserved. But for Catherine of Valois, queen consort to one of England's greatest kings and matriarch of an entire royal house, Westminster was something altogether different. It was a hallway, a corner, a makeshift shelf where her coffin sat for centuries, unmarked, unprotected, and increasingly grotesque. There was no tomb, only a lead casket buckled and stained. Placed upright against a pillar near Henry VI's magnificent shrine, Catherine's coffin seemed almost accidental, as though someone had forgotten it there. Visitors to the abbey sometimes passed within arm's reach of her exposed remains, without knowing who or what they were seeing. Over time, the lead casing began to warp. In some places, it split, revealing fragments of cerecloth, the waxed linen used in medieval embalming, wrapped tightly around what had once been regal flesh. But Catherine's body had not decayed in the usual way. Because her coffin had never been properly sealed and the room remained unusually dry, and still an eerie form of preservation had taken place. Her skin had hardened. Her features, though sunken and leathery, retained human form. Her hands folded across her body for eternity became desiccated claws. Her once glorious face, which had captivated both English and French courts, now stared with hollow cheeks and tightened lips at the vaulted ceiling above. This was not reverence, it was exposure bordering on spectacle, and the symbolism was thick. Catherine, the queen, who had defied law to love, who had been hidden in life and denied in death, now became a curiosity. Visitors began to speak of her as the upright coffin, a quiet oddity among the abbey's more celebrated tombs. Children dared one another to touch her. Monks looked away. Some guides whispered her name with theatrical reverence. Others didn't mention her at all. There was no plaque, no epitaph. Only a presence. For nearly 250 years, no one intervened. Monarchs came and went. Thrones changed hands. Civil wars raged. The abbey itself was ransacked and restored. Yet Catherine remained ever silent, ever visible, ever disturbingly intact. By the 17th century, her corpse had gained a reputation. Writers mentioned her in passing as a mummy, a term that stripped her of humanity, and repackaged her as an artifact. In private, some visitors claimed to have seen her eyes still closed, her lips sealed as if in prayer. Then came the tourists. By the early 1700s, Westminster Abbey had transformed into more than a church. It was a national theater of memory. Visitors came not only to worship, but to see. The tombs of kings and queens became attractions. Guides began to allow informal viewings. And in the case of Catherine, there was no need to open a tomb. She was already waiting. Some reached out and touched her. Others whispered stories half true, half invented about her secret marriage and defiance. A few dared more. Then in the early 1800s, the desecration took a name. George the Before. Before he became King George, then Prince of Wales, visited the abbey and was shown Catherine's coffin. Whether out of youthful arrogance, insatiable curiosity, or some darker impulse, he reportedly requested to see inside. The story varies in detail depending on the source, but the core fact remains consistent. The coffin was opened and the body was touched. One version claims that George reached in and kissed the face of the long-dead queen. Another suggests he merely laid a hand upon her cheek. What is certain is this: the heir to the throne physically interacted with the corpse of his many times great-grandmother, breaking centuries of silence with a gesture that was either reverent or revolting or both. No one stopped him. No guard intervened. This was not the age of preservation or forensic respect. It was the age of spectacle. After the encounter, Catherine's coffin was left open for a time. The damage worsened. Her body, already dry and fragile, began to deteriorate. Air exposure caused portions of the cerecloth to crumble. Dust settled in her eye sockets. Visitors wrote of their unease not at the sight of her body, but at the indifference with which it was treated. She had become not a queen, not even a mother of kings, but a thing a display between altars. Even in this indignity, her placement held macabre meaning. Just steps away, her husband Henry V rested in imperial splendor, encased in ornate wood and bronze. His likeness adorned in armor, his tomb shielded by rails and reverence. And beside him, propped like forgotten luggage, was Catherine. No inscription, no memorial, just a shrinking body in a decaying shell. This juxtaposition revealed the cruel arithmetic of monarchy. A king's memory was gold-leafed and preserved, a queen's conditional. Only when the discomfort of her visibility outweighed the burden of historical shame would anything be done. But that reckoning would still take decades to arrive. Until then, Catherine's fate was to remain visible yet voiceless, a silent rebuke to the institution that had sought to erase her. But time and scandal were running out. By the dawn of the 19th century, Catherine of Valois had spent nearly 400 years resting in plain sight, but resting is too generous a word. Her coffin, now partially split and sagging, had become a quiet embarrassment for Westminster Abbey. It was not just a neglect of burial protocol. It was an ongoing public spectacle that blurred the line between royal reverence and morbid voyeurism. What was once a solemn burial had become a grotesque exhibit. The decision not to rebury Catherine had never been officially explained. It was in part the product of inertia. England's monarchy had survived civil wars, religious upheaval, and regime changes, but few had the courage or perhaps the desire to reach back and mend the political wounds Catherine represented. Her presence, half hidden, half exposed, reminded everyone of a queen who had dared to choose love over lineage humanity, over hierarchy. And that made her dangerous even in death. For the Anglican establishment, whose power rested on preserving royal continuity and sacred tradition, Catherine's coffin was a problem with no simple solution. She wasn't just a former queen. She was the grandmother of the Tudors whose rise had toppled the Plantagenets. To honor her risked validating the marriage to Owen Tudor. To ignore her only magnified the obscenity of her decaying corpse, displayed like a relic in a tourist corridor. So they did what institutions often do when confronted with uncomfortable history: nothing. For decades, Abbey custodians made half-hearted efforts to drape her coffin with cloth or obscure it behind furniture. But the stories still spread. Tourists wrote letters about the mummy queen. Children recounted ghost tales of the weeping woman behind the pillar. Guides, some pious, some opportunistic, began offering glimpses quietly and unofficially for those who tipped well enough. No moment of reflection, no decree from on high. Just silence and passive decay. One clergyman in the 1840s described Catherine's body as a shrinking effigy of royal neglect, posed like an accusation in lead. She had become not just a curiosity, but a symbol of institutional cowardice. Her body dared a question the monarchy couldn't answer. What happens when the very blood that births kings is treated like a stain? Meanwhile, other royals received restorations. Effigies were polished, tombs were repainted. Henry V's resting place, resplendent and intact, was elevated to national pride, his image cast in warlike splendor. But just beside him, barely concealed, his queen's corpse shrank year by year. She was reduced not just by time, but by choice. And the public noticed. Writers like Horace Walpole and later Victorian commentators used Catherine as a moral anecdote, an example of dignity undone by societal hypocrisy. Some saw in her a metaphor for womanhood erased, others a grim warning of what happens to those who dare love outside royal permission. But the real horror lay not in what had been done, but in what had not. Catherine had never been exhumed. She had never been reburied. She had simply been left open, accessible, and haunting. Then came the antiquarians. As historical preservation gained traction in the late 1800s, interest in royal burials surged. Westminster Abbey, once a half-functional church and half-public curiosity, began transitioning into a more formal museum of English monarchy. Names were catalogued, tombs restored. Skeletons, even those long ignored, were evaluated and repositioned. Catherine by now was more bone than body. Her cerecloth had degraded. The last remnants of flesh were brittle and stained. Her face, once barely recognizable, had caved. And yet her bones remained loosely arranged in a collapsed cradle of lead and linen, unmistakably human and heartbreakingly discarded. What disturbed some reformers most wasn't simply the condition of her remains, it was the ritual absence surrounding them. No prayers, no royal markers, no effort to acknowledge her as either sinner or saint. It was as if history had stopped just short of recognizing her as anything at all. But history would not stay silent forever. As the Victorian fascination with death rituals intensified, Catherine became something else a story. A point of obsession for preservationists. A ghost embedded in the Abbey's very architecture. Some spoke of feeling watched near her resting place. Others imagined whispers at twilight prayers. Whether real or imagined, the haunting of Catherine was no longer about phantoms. It was about a nation reckoning with its own selective memory. The pressure mounted. Public whispers turned into academic demands. The question now was not if she would be reburied, but how. With honor, with ceremony, with an apology, and who exactly would do it. The monarchy, still skittish, remained silent. The church hesitated. No one wished to take responsibility for centuries of indifference. Yet the image of Catherine slumped and shrinking in her disintegrating casket beside the shining tomb of her husband had become too grotesque to ignore. Something had to give. And in the decades that followed, the silence would finally crack not with a trumpet, not with a decree, but with the dull scrape of stone and the hush of late apology. But the desecration wasn't finished yet. The desecration of Catherine of Valois reached its psychological climax, not through war or revolution, but through a moment so casually horrific it defies easy comprehension. It did not come from mobs or looters, but from a prince, one who would later wear the crown himself. The story is elusive, the details shadowed by time, but its essence is widely accepted and endlessly repeated, that George, Prince of Wales, later King George IV, physically touched the remains of Catherine of Valois. In the early 1800s, George visited Westminster Abbey, not as a mourner, but as a connoisseur of the macabre. The prince was known for excess gluttony, vanity, and theatrical flair. His fascination with the past wasn't rooted in reverence, but spectacle. And as he passed the tomb of Henry V, it's said that he paused, then turned, perhaps casually, perhaps hungrily, to look upon the decaying form resting nearby. Catherine's coffin, still upright and cracked, offered no resistance. The cerecloth had long since pulled away from portions of her face. Her skeletal frame lay barely obscured by tattered wrappings. There were no guards, no barriers, no reverent distance. And so the heir to the throne stepped forward and reached in. Accounts differ on what precisely he did. Some say he kissed her. Others claim he merely touched her cheek. Still others allege that he poked, lifted, even handled the bones, marveling at their texture. In any case, the act occurred. A royal descendant several generations removed made direct contact with the centuries-old corpse of the Tudor matriarch. There was no scandal, no outcry, no ceremony of repentance. It was chalked up to eccentricity, a footnote in the life of a wayward prince. But in that moment, intimate, disturbing, and unrecorded by any official source, centuries of silence were broken by fingers that had no right to be there. The significance was not just physical, it was symbolic. In that gesture, Catherine of Valois, already stripped of her royal burial, her narrative muted by law, her corpse left to rot, was violated again. The very institution that had denied her dignity now used her as a curiosity, a thing to be handled. Even in death, she was not sovereign over her own body. This was not the act of a nation honoring its past. It was the reflex of a lineage feeding on its own shame. Worse still, the abbey said nothing. Her coffin was left open for some time afterward, exposed to air and dust. The structure sagged further. The face, what remained of it, began to collapse inward. Visitors passed by the site daily, many unaware that the crumbling shape in the corner was once Queen of England, mother of a dynasty, and widow to its most lionized king. But Catherine's story was not forgotten. It was transformed. Writers seized upon the tale. Poets, especially those drawn to the Gothic, saw in her decayed form a metaphor for lost virtue, political hypocrisy, and the grotesque decay of empire. In 1838, the poet Letitia Elizabeth Landon wrote of Catherine's remains outstretched beneath the careless tread of power, capturing in verse what the nation would not say aloud, that this queen had been wronged. Even Charles Dickens, ever attuned to the intersections of morality and spectacle, referred indirectly to Catherine's body in his 1841 essays describing how Westminster's sainted dust often lay dishonored by modern eyes. The irony was sharp. Catherine's descendants sat on the throne, first the Tudors, then the Stuarts, and finally the Hanoverians, yet none had dared to dignify her with a proper tomb. Her offspring ruled in her name, but her body was treated like discarded scaffolding for their empire. Meanwhile, the English people grew increasingly obsessed with the morbid. The Victorian era was dawning a time of mourning jewelry, post-mortem photography, and medical exhibitions. Catherine's half-preserved corpse seemed to fit perfectly into a culture that venerated the dead but disrespected the dead body. But to historians and clergy who still possessed a moral compass, the sight of Catherine's remains, gray, sunken, violated, was intolerable. A movement began to stir. It started not with kings, but with curators, archivists, and archivally inclined clergy. Men who believed that England owed something to its past, not grandeur perhaps, but at least closure. Discussions began behind abbey doors about how to handle the queen in the wall. Could she be exhumed? Should she be reinterred beside her husband? And what of the legal ambiguity surrounding her descendants? Nothing was immediate. Nothing was public. The church hesitated to confront its own complicity. The monarchy had no interest in elevating a story it had spent 4 centuries trying to forget. But Catherine had become in death too loud to ignore. And then quietly plans were laid. No fanfare, no royal announcement, just the slow, creaking machinery of institutional guilt preparing to do what should have been done centuries earlier. But before peace, there would be one more indignity, one last delay, one final act of silence. Because by the time the abbey was ready to move, her most had forgotten why she had ever been hidden to begin with. By the mid-19th century, Catherine of Valois was no longer a body, she was a contradiction. Her bones, brittle and folded inside a ruptured coffin, lay in the holiest corridor of English monarchy, yet had been desecrated with the kind of impunity usually reserved for nameless corpses. Her blood, meanwhile, coursed through every sovereign on the throne since Henry VIII. She was the mother of the Tudor dynasty, the grandmother of royal legitimacy, and yet she remained unclaimed physically and symbolically. There was no effort by the crown to repair her legacy. The monarchy, now entrenched in Victorian formality and obsessed with control, had little appetite for confronting the sins of centuries past. The church, too, offered no statement, no memorial. And so Catherine lay there, still upright, cracked, desiccated like a forgotten warning in lead. But while institutions ignored her, the public did not. Visitors continued to pass by her broken coffin. Some documented what they saw, scribbled diary entries, travel notes, darkly reverent sketches. To the growing number of British citizens obsessed with genealogy, Catherine became a macabre fascination. The idea that the founder of the Tudor line could be so thoroughly discarded drew gasps. Children of empire stood in the shadow of a woman who birthed its foundations, yet whose bones were left to collapse in public view. And still, no one moved her. In one recorded instance from the 1850s, a clergyman noted seeing a group of schoolboys pressing their faces to the lead and pointing at what they believed to be her teeth. The clergy did nothing. The visitors left laughing. There was no restoration effort, no sense of scandal. The grotesque had become normalized. It was quite literally baked into the stone of the abbey. But within the archives of Westminster, some had not forgotten. Curators and early preservationists, many working unpaid or unofficially, began advocating for the reinterment of bodies like Catherine's. These were the same men cataloging broken tombs, identifying lost identities, and restoring the damaged gravestones of long-dead bishops. They saw Catherine's corpse not just as a scandal, but as a failure of national memory. They made quiet appeals. These efforts gathered momentum not because of royal conscience, but because of optics. Westminster Abbey, increasingly visited by foreigners and citizens alike, was under pressure to look the part of a sacred royal necropolis. And Catherine, exposed, collapsed, irreverently positioned, was a problem too visible to ignore. And so in 1878, more than 440 years after her death, it was finally decided. Catherine of Valois would be reinterred. The plan was unceremonious. Her remains were not given a funeral. There was no public announcement. She was not even removed far, simply relocated into a vault beneath the altar of the Lady Chapel, an area dedicated to Henry VII, her own grandson. In death, at last mother and son would rest in architectural proximity. But there was no monument, no epitaph, no statue. Her reburial was closer to an act of damage control than restitution. Even her coffin was not repaired. Her bones, now fully exposed, were gathered, what was left of them, and placed in a container beneath the paving stones. A queen of England, a daughter of France, a woman who had carried the future of a dynasty inside her womb, was tucked into the floor. The Abbey issued no statement. The monarchy said nothing. The archives recorded the reburial in a line or two, devoid of emotion. There was no apology. It is worth asking what Catherine would have thought. In life she had been a prize of empire, a pawn in treaties, and then defiantly a woman who chose love over expectation. She bore children in defiance of law, risked disgrace for intimacy, and gave birth to the bloodline that would define England's future. And for this she was punished quietly, ruthlessly, and over centuries. By the time she was reburied, Catherine had become less a person and more a legend, but not the kind that crowns monuments. Hers was a legacy trapped between silence and scandal memory and suppression. And there was one final insult. Though her remains were placed beneath the Lady Chapel floor, no stone marked the spot. Tourists walked over her every day, their feet echoing on the same slabs that concealed her bones. Guides pointed to the tomb of Henry VII, the magnificence of Elizabeth III, the glories of empire, all while Catherine remained physically beneath them, but absent from the story. Her body was gone from sight, but not from consequence. Because while Catherine was being slowly erased from stone and ritual, her descendants were recasting the monarchy in her image. Her blood filtered through the Tudors, the Stuarts, and finally the Windsors still ruled. Her love story, though punished, had redefined the genetic line of British kings and queens. And still no one spoke her name. The silence around Catherine was never accidental. It was strategic. Her life presented questions too uncomfortable for monarchy to answer. Can a queen be human? Can love justify defiance? Can lineage survive scandal? The answer in Catherine's case was yes, but the cost was centuries of wrought ridicule and repression. When the stone slabs were finally lifted in 1878, and Catherine of Valois' remains were lowered into the vault beneath Henry VII's Lady Chapel, no choir sang. No bishop presided. There was no gun salute, no mourning procession through London's grey streets. Instead, her reburial passed like a routine maintenance task, mechanical, cold, and unworthy of the woman being entombed. The absence was louder than any hymn. Even the location was a paradox. On one hand, Catherine was finally laid to rest beneath the chapel built by her grandson, the founder of the Tudor dynasty who owed his very crown to her defiance. But on the other, she remained physically unacknowledged. No brass plate, no sculpture, not even a name etched in the stone above. Catherine, once a queen, was now less memorialized than minor clerics buried nearby. And this was not oversight, it was calculation. The royal establishment, even in the high Victorian age of order and grandeur, still flinched at Catherine's legacy. To name her would be to explain her. And to explain her would be to reveal the unresolved trauma at the core of England's monarchy, that one of its defining dynasties was born not from divine succession, but from a forbidden love, a relationship that had been illegal, unrecognized, and nearly erased. In the silence of that tomb, Catherine's bones settled into darkness. But her story never did. In the decades that followed, her legacy remained unspoken in palaces, but increasingly discussed in books, letters, and the growing field of public history. By the early 20th century, scholars began asking why a woman so central to royal succession had been treated with such studied disdain. Theories abounded. Some claimed it was misogyny, others political discomfort. The truth as always lay somewhere in the jagged intersections of both. Meanwhile, England continued to walk over her. Thousands of tourist historians and worshippers stepped across the Lady Chapel floor each year, unaware they were passing above the remains of a queen consort. They marveled at the tombs of Elizabeth I and Mary. Queen of Scots read aloud the names of monarchs, bishops, and nobles, all while Catherine lay unspoken, her body silenced as completely as her memory. There were occasional suggestions, mostly in niche academic circles, to install a plaque or small memorial in her honor. But nothing came of them. Her story lacked the nationalistic utility of Henry I's conquests or the pageantry of Elizabethan pride. Catherine's narrative was untidy: a French queen, a secret lover, an unblessed marriage, a coffin, left open a corpse touched by a prince. No empire builds statues for that. And yet her absence continued to haunt the record. Every time a new generation studied the Tudors, Catherine returned not as a noble figure, but as a question. How could a woman so consequential be treated with such disdain? What did that say about the institutions built on her legacy? What does it still say? By the time the 20th century rolled into its second half, England's monarchy had transformed. War had shaken its divine image. Abdication had fractured its succession myths. But Catherine's bones remained where they had been placed, beneath stone, beneath silence, beneath a weight far heavier than any coffin shame. And in that final resting place, Catherine embodied the full arc of monarchy's quiet brutality. She had been used married for treaty, ignored, denied a voice after her husband's death, feared, criminalized for seeking affection, exiled, buried without honor, and finally desecrated, then reburied without name. She became a case study in royal erasure, and yet her story never truly vanished. Writers continued to resurrect her. Documentarians walked the Abbey corridors pointing to the empty space beside her husband's tomb. Novels reimagined her romance. Essays scoured records for proof of her marriage. Even in death, Catherine refused to disappear. The institutions that buried her did not realize you cannot silence a foundation, because every monarch from Henry VII onward carried her defiance in their veins. Her illegitimate love had become official history. Her secret children had become crowned heads. Her dismissed legacy had become the unacknowledged cornerstone of British identity. But the burial gave her no peace. To this day, there is still no monument to Catherine of Valois. No plaque, no annual mass, no formal recognition. Her bones rest in shadow, her memory in limbo, granted just enough dignity to be buried, but never enough to be honored. And for all the solemnity of her final vault, Catherine's story continues to throb beneath the Abbey stones, like a pulse in the dark. She was never given a voice. But history is still listening. Catherine of Valois remains one of the most unsettling figures in English royal history, not because of what she did in life, but because of what was done to her in death. Her legacy is not framed by grandeur, but by absence. Not by what was said, but by what was intentionally left unsaid. For centuries, England's most sacred space harbored not just a body, but a contradiction. A queen whose womb birthed a dynasty, whose love reshaped the monarchy, and whose corpse was left to rot beside the very man whose crown she once shared. Her slow erasure was not the product of neglect alone, it was an institutional decision, reinforced over generations by silence, discomfort, and fear. What does it say of a monarchy that will polish the marble effigies of warrior kings, yet leave the mother of their bloodline exposed to dust and fingertips? What does it say of a church that will sanctify the dead, yet allow a queen to become a hallway attraction? And what does it say of a people who claim to revere their history, but walk daily above Catherine's forgotten vault without ever speaking her name? Catherine's burial tells us something essential, something painful about power. That memory is not just preserved through ritual, but also manipulated through omission. That a crown can protect you in life, but fail you in death. That even in institutions built to immortalize some stories are buried deeper than the bones. We do not know if Catherine would have wanted a monument. We do not know if she saw her choices as defiance, or simply as the human desire to love. But we know this: her bloodline survived the rot. Her descendants sat on every throne that followed. And her story, scrubbed, denied, delayed, has emerged once again. Not because it was honored, but because it refused to stay buried.